Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our podcast. Thank you so much to our latest guest speaker, which is Bode Gower, and he's going to be here today to speak on educational policies that are currently affecting modern education. So, before we get started, my name is Sabrina Welch, and Bode, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. First off, Sabrina, thanks so much for the invitation to come on to your podcast. Super excited to be here. As Sabrina mentioned, my name is Bode Gower. I'm the founder and chair of the Northern California Youth Policy Coalition, a little bit of a tongue twister there. But we do advocacy for rural youth across Northern California, and super excited to be on today and to speak with you, Sabrina.
Yay! Thank you so much for coming again. We're super excited to have this conversation. And with that, let's hop right into it. So, when we first began emailing, like we were talking a little bit before, we were initially speaking about the initial defunding of the Department of Education and also the dismantling of the Department of Education.
Yeah.
However, lots of stuff has happened since then. But to begin, do you have any thoughts on the dismantling of the Department of Education? And if so, what effects have you seen in your personal community from the dismantling?
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially in this political environment, everything happens so rapidly. It's a moving environment every single day. It seems like something new and dramatic is changing. There's a few things with the Department of Education in particular I did want to mention. Recently, the Department of Ed discontinued a rural mental health grant for rural communities and school districts across the United States. It really did impact a lot of school districts across Northern California. And part of this was that a lot of the funding from this grant directly went to funding decreasing student to teacher and counselor to teacher and student ratios. It also really tried to help to get the amount of people that were at suicide risk down. And part of this, the discontinuation, was that according to the administration, I actually have a little data over here, so if you see me looking over here, that's why. But according to the administration, a lot of part of this grant was going towards DEI funding and DEI programs. The problem with that is a lot of school districts, frankly, they don't include DEI programs in their teaching and in their credentials. And so for them, and especially like my school district, which we actually got our mental health grant discontinued as well, it really placed a burden on our school district. Our staff had to, I think they fired half of our counselors that were directly towards mental health in particular, and that really did put a large burden on our students here in our school district. I live in Mendocino County in Northern California. We have the second highest rate of ACEs score in the state of California. It also impacted another county, Trinity County, which is even further north, up near the Oregon border. They have the highest rate of poverty in the state of California. And so we're seeing these real impacts on students. And I was talking with a couple superintendents up here in Northern California, and they said from a large perspective, they rarely, if ever, deal with the U.S. Department of Ed. And they said, to be frank, if they started cutting, a bunch of people that didn't impact students, they don't really care about that because they don't really impact them, or they don't really deal with the Department of Ed in their normal lives. They'll deal with, county departments and the state Department of Ed. But the problem that they really have is once it starts impacting students directly, that's when we really see these problems arise. And this mental health grant, for example, that is one thing in particular that has been a real struggle and strain onto our students. Here in my school district in ECI Unified, we saw a huge drop in the amount of students that ranked both on the ACEs score, as well as those that saw a significant decrease in the amount of people that felt that they had a high risk of self-harm. We saw that decrease. And part of that came from the mental health grant, and our school district really making sure that we're delivering the funding where we said that we were going to deliver it. And so, we've done a lot of work here across Northern California and many partners nationally to really try to make sure and inform the Department of Ed saying, hey, these are not DEI programs. Their programs are directly going to fund rural students in particular. And so that's really something that I did want to mention and highlight in part of that. And, the one good thing I shouldn't say that a good thing with dismantling the Department of Ed, but one part of it is that superintendents don't really care as much if it's dismantled, as long as there's two parts to this. As long as the funding that is currently coming from the national government goes to the state government and they still get their funding. And additionally, they really want to make sure that this is not impacting kids directly. And so those are some things that we're starting to see coming from the federal government and really impacting us as students here, not only in Northern California, but across the nation.
Absolutely. Observing that impact again, and especially with defundings of a lot of state government. I know you said that you had your school experience defunding. My state has also received a massive defunding and their
Yeah.
grants. And do you think, on the topic of that, do you think that states are disproportionately affected by the Department of Education being dismantled?
I don't know if we could use the term disproportionately, but I do believe that there are some states that will have higher amounts of cancellation of federal funds going to their state. Coming from California, we are particularly targeted in that, and I do believe that. And part of that is, though, we have higher scrutiny. Especially doesn't help when our public officials here in California attack the federal administration. It doesn't help us here. But what we saw was that, I can't say this for sure, but we saw that more. When we go back to the mental health grant, we saw the majority of those districts that can't got their mental health grants canceled were in blue leaning areas. And so part of that is we got to continue to say to the administration, saying, hey, you know no matter where we are, no matter where we're from, no matter our background or our political identity, we still matter. We still need this funding because we still are trying to deliver a quality education for our students. And that is something that we need to emphasize and that we're continuing to emphasize not only here in California, but in DC, saying, hey, we're standing up for our students and we need you to help and back us in this.
Definitely, absolutely. That was such a strong point, is that political ideologies and things like that should never divide the nation in a way that's going to affect the quality of education for our
Yeah.
children and students here. Thank you so much for that answer. That was definitely a great insight into the dismantling of the Department of Education and its implications. It makes sense. And continuing on with the impact to K through 12 education and going also back to grants and elimination of programs that have been deemed to be helpful, what impact does the elimination of federal DEI programs have on efforts to promote inclusivity and equity in education, in your opinion?
I don't really think that if we look at it from a holistic perspective, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. I think that it's ingrained in a lot of our education, showing that we don't talk about what our differences are in education. We talk about what unites us, and that's important. I don't think that a lot of DEI programs, frankly, are even taught in schools in general. Um, Part of the budget coming out from the Department of Ed, and I think it was out of the Office of Management, the budget office there in DC. They used terms in their budget, their federal budget, that this was funding radical left programs, that it was funding DEI programs, that it was funding critical race theory. And superintendents will tell you, we do not teach CRT, critical race theory. We do not teach that in our schools. We do not teach DEI programs in our schools. Um, Here in California, we have a graduation requirement that you have to, starting I think in 2028. I could be completely wrong on what the exact year is, but in the next few years, graduation requirements for high school students, you have to have to take an ethnic studies class. That is not, teaching DEI. That is learning history about our country and our nation. And so that really is part of it that's going into this. And so when we talk about how our DEI program cuts going to directly impact students, it should not have impacted students. But when the federal government is saying that something like a mental health grant or funding for rural schools, which we've seen in DC right now, those are not mental health, or those are not DEI programs. Those are programs that are directly impacting students in the most positive way possible.
Continuing on again with K through 12 education, if you may have heard about the PBS being defunded, I want to ask, what are the potential effects of Executive Order 14290, which ended federal funding for NPR and PBS, which was educational programming, one of the largest television networks for kids and access to educational content? And what do you think the defunding of those programs will have for children development and their education?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, both you, Sabrina, and I can attest to this, is that growing up watching PBS when we were little, watching some of these classic TV shows,
Mhm.
I was a little surprised to see this, to be frank, that we were seeing the administration cut federal funding for, public um, public radio and all that stuff.
Yeah.
As someone that has a podcast and a radio show on a public radio station, we are talking directly about how is this going to impact us as people trying to get the news out. Part of our First Amendment rights, we learn this in government class, is that freedom of speech, that freedom of press. And part of that really is important that is maintained in our Constitution, that it's important that our administration continues to fully fund public radio and making sure that people have the right to watch. And also, frankly, PBS, it's probably one of the most nonpartisan um, TV shows, TV stations that is out there. And there's quite a few stations out there that we could both say that aren't very nonpartisan, they're very partisan shows. And so it's important, though, that we have our administration, continue to fund and not cut funding from these programs, because a lot of public radio stations across the nation, especially small public radio stations in small rural areas like here in Mendocino County, we're seeing how they're barely scrapping by to make sure that they are keeping up the radio station in our communities. And so it's really going to make sure, and it's really going to have an impact on us as people here across the nation, especially in small rural areas.
That definitely is a great point, especially with the rural areas and bringing up the impacts that that will have on those areas. And continuing on with the discussion of PBS and how PBS actually is one of the largest television networks to serve underprivileged
Yeah.
communities. So, talking on this type of topic, how might the defunding of public media outlets like PBS affect childhood education, particularly in underprivileged communities or low income communities?
Yeah. Well, I don't know directly of how it's going to impact those communities, but what I can say is, coming from an area where we have a high rate of people that are socioeconomic disadvantaged, we have a high rate of people that are first generation, that really, we're going to see those impacts directly, they're going to hit close to home. And we're going to see those impacts starting to come out over the next few years. And so, really, for us, it's continuing to make sure that we're working with our federal partners to fully fund these programs, to continue this funding, and standing up to them saying, hey, you cannot do this. This is not right. When we come back to rural education in particular, we're seeing these impacts directly because our coalition talks with youth almost every single day. And what we're hearing from them across Southern California in over 30 counties with over 250 high schools, what we're hearing from them is that they're saying that us as students don't feel heard, we don't feel seen, we don't feel like our voices really matter in the public policy process. And so for us, it's important that we're expressing these opinions to our local elected officials and our statewide elected officials, saying, hey, we're hearing these concerns from people all across Northern California. We're hearing these voices from people all across rural communities across the nation. We're working on legislation right now in Washington, D.C., that is trying to fully fund rural education, fully fund special education across the nation. Because for us, when we look at, these communities directly that we live in, that are, high socioeconomic disadvantaged communities that have a high rate of first gen students that are really trying to get by and scrape by most of the times. It's important that we're standing up and really trying to make a difference in our communities. And part of that is that direct legislative advocacy work that we've been doing. And so for us, it's continuing to make sure that how it's just going to impact, small and low income communities. For us, it's part of that. Yeah, it may impact, but what we're trying to do is then stand up and really try to make a difference in pushing back on some of these measures that are coming through and from the federal government.
That's absolutely a very strong answer for sure, and I definitely see that point of view, definitely. So, continuing on with the funding and grants and different reductions from different programs and such, I want to ask a little bit about how these reforms are affecting universities. So I know that we talked a little bit more so about primary education so far, but moving on to universities, I want to ask, in what ways could the reduction in federal support for public universities influence research, innovation, and different types of things that are happening at the university level?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk directly here on a local scale. We have a state university here that part of their funding is received from the state government as well as from the federal government, some of the grant programs. And with the cutting, and this is not only from the federal government, this is a bunch of different ways in which they've lost funding from the state government and the federal government. So it's not only the federal government's fault, but it's a few ways. They are cutting 26 of their departments. They're cutting all of their sports programs, so they have no more sports athletic programs. They're cutting almost all of their extracurricular activities and programs on campus. And so when we're talking about, especially here in rural communities where we see a lack of access to education beyond just high school, we're going to see these federal cuts directly impact rural communities. And in a time where we see it's important now more than ever to fund education, this is not the time to pull back our funding for full education for our students. It's important that we're delivering a quality education for our students. And going back to what I was saying earlier with the mental health grant, for example, is that a lot of people in education and superintendents, they don't care about the cutting of administration people in the Department of Ed. What they care about and what we're seeing directly is getting impacted is as long as these cuts are not directly impacting students, and that's what we should really be caring about. The problem that we're seeing right now is that on the majority and the scale right now is that these cuts from the federal government, especially directly on universities, are directly impacting our students and their ability to seek future opportunities. Part of the administration is cutting the ability for some universities to have a chance to apply for federal internships. The State Department cut a lot of their summer programs that they were doing. They're not seeking any more applicants for them, and so these are really limiting the amount of opportunities that students will have to further their academic success and their career success as well. And so for us, it's now more important than ever to stand up and to say, hey, these cuts are directly impacting the students, and let's work towards a solution where we can find a way that, you want to cut parts of the federal government and the Department of Ed in particular. Let's work towards that at the same time, making sure that these cuts are not impacting students. Because that's really where we're at right now, is that they are directly impacting our students, and it's not okay and it's not right.
I definitely agree with that for sure. On the topic of that too, do you think that we're going to see a downwards trend in the future of research due to these university grants that are limiting student access to research opportunities?
I don't know if we'll what exactly we'll see with that, because you will have administrations will change and federal funding will go up and down. So we'll see how those measures directly impact. Right now, over the next few years, you may see a decrease in that, but I can't really say. But what I can say right now is that when we're seeing these cuts directly impacting universities and their ability to do research and their ability to do some of these programs, you're going to see over the next few years how students may try to go abroad for different programs. They're going to leave and try to find these opportunities instead of staying here. So we may see some of those impacts directly on our university campuses. I can't tell you exactly what they were because I don't really know. But we will see these impacts, and I think that we will see these impacts over the next few years on our universities and our students. And part of these cuts is that we have some, superintendents across the nation that are scared to speak out against these cuts. There was a superintendent I was talking to, and I don't remember where they're from, but they were telling me that the New York Times reached out to them to do an article on some of the federal cuts, and the superintendent did not want to speak out against these cuts because they were scared about how that could possibly impact their school district and therefore their students. And so, really, not only in university approach, but also with our students as well, both in high school and also in the universities, we're going to see these impacts directly. And so that is some parts that I'm concerned about that we're seeing, and hopefully that we can find a way in the next few years to figure that out.
Absolutely, that definitely makes sense for sure. And I definitely agree with the truth that so many people, especially when they know that their advocacy could affect their students, can kind of impact the amount of advocacy happening
Yeah.
against these reforms. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about that and how, like, almost like fear tactics are making people nervous to speak out?
I think that part of that, as I mentioned, was that first part, where superintendents are concerned to speak out. but I also work with superintendents directly. Right now we're working through the Department of Ed right now to appeal the mental health grant decision to making sure that we are funding our students. And what we're telling the Department of Ed right now is that these programs are not DEI. What they are is they're funding the future education of our students and of our workforce in our country and our communities. And so for us, it's not, we don't say we're seeing some of these impacts directly, these cuts impact us. But what we're saying to the Department of Ed is, hey, we understand that these cuts are impacting students. What they need to do is they cannot impact students because that is what we're really, part of the funding of education is making sure that we're providing quality education for our students. And so we're really emphasizing that point that these cuts are directly impacting America's children. And so that is something that has really been helpful in getting through the Department of Ed. We're working with a few national partners on a bill fully funding rural education across the nation, impacting 10 million kids, 4,400 school districts. And so we are on the cusp of getting that passed through Congress, and we're super excited about that. We're going to continue to work with our partners, no matter if they're Republicans or Democrats, to fully fund education for all of our students, no matter their background, no matter where they're from, no matter their political background. You know, these cuts in funding are a bump in the road, but they don't mean that they are permanent. And that's the part that we're emphasizing to students and superintendents, is that it's not a permanent cutting in funding. It's temporary. But what that means is that we still need to speak up. We still need to get our voices out there to say, hey, these cuts are impacting students, and here's ways in which we can make sure these cuts still occur without, making sure that they're impacting students directly. I do agree with some what the administration says, and that there's a lot of bureaucracy that's still in the federal government that could possibly cut. But as long as those cuts aren't, as I've said multiple times, impacting students, it's okay because we can find ways to get around those. And so, really, what we're trying to do is making sure that our students have that full funding of education, as well as making sure that we are speaking out in strong support of our students.
That's definitely a very admirable answer of how what we should look forward to is that these bumps in the road are not permanent and that there's things that we can do. And on the topic of that, with especially your work with helping out student superintendents with
Yeah.
trying to work towards a solution, what advice or what message would you like to say to superintendents across the nation?
Yeah, well, first off, part of this is we are seeing, as I mentioned, a bump in the road in the education for our students and the funding for education. We're seeing that, there are programs that are being eliminating our English language acquisition programs, our English language learner programs are being eliminated. We're also seeing these impacts with the mental health grant. We're seeing some of these negative impacts. However, there are still positives that are in a pipeline that we're seeing. We are on the cusp of passing the Secure Schools Reauthorization Act, funding 4,400 school districts, 10 million kids. We're working every single day to fully fund individuals with disabilities, Education IDA Act. We're really trying to work to make sure that we are funding education for our students, no matter where they are, no matter their background, no matter where they're from. And so for us, it's yes, we're seeing these bumps in the roads at this moment, but it's important that we still work with our federal partners. We don't just throw up our hands and say, well, we tried. It's persistent effort. SRS, I can speak about because we've worked a lot on this. SRS failed in the last 118th Congress, and we got it reintroduced in the 119th, and hopefully we're on the cusp of passing it in the next few months. And so, really, part of that work is that persistent effort, being nicely persistent. That's what someone likes to call as nicely persistent. And so for us, it's for superintendents saying, hey, yes, we're seeing these bumps, we're seeing these cuts, we're seeing how they are impacting our students, but it does not mean that we just give up, that we throw up our hands and say, hey, we tried. It means that we get back up on our ship, that we continue to work with our federal partners, no matter some of the things that they do, no matter some of the crazy decisions that they make. It's important for us to continue working with them to strive to make sure that education's a little bit better off for all of our students, no matter where they're from. And so for us, it's continuing to emphasize that message to not only our superintendents, but some of our students who are a little concerned for what their future looks like. It's telling them that, hey, the opportunities will still be there, that we can still continue to make a little bit of a difference for all of our communities all across the nation.
Absolutely, definitely. That's a great message. And on that topic too, what do you think that superintendents can do right now?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that they can do. My superintendent has been an absolutely awesome advocate for rural communities. There's a few superintendents that I could speak for and absolutely awesome. They are the reason that a lot of measures in Washington D.C. related to funding for rural education that will continue. They are the reason that it will continue. With the mental health grant, I talk a lot about the impact that they will have on students, but I also want to talk about there's a good chance that a lot of the grant components will go back to rural school districts, that they will still be continued. We are still appealing in the process to make sure that we can have this program funded.
Mhm.
And what I can say directly to superintendents is, make sure that you are speaking up for your communities, making sure that you are continuing that persistent effort to making sure that your students get the best funding that they deserve, not only that they need but they deserve. And so, really, that's part of the efforts that we're trying to do. And what I really do, continue to say to superintendents is, hey, yeah, a part of this is also is getting your students involved. As a senior in high school that's graduating in a week, can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Um, as someone that's almost there, we're continuing to get students not only in our school district involved, but across Southern California, and we're working with national partners across the nation to get students from every single background, every single community involved in this process, to making sure that our elected officials are hearing our voices loud and clear as young people, saying, "Hey, let's look back at this. Let's take a step back. Let's look at how can we make sure that these funding measures continue to deserve and deliver a quality education for our students."
Definitely. That's a great action, call to action is that if you stay persistent in a clear and active manner, then that will most likely lead to hopefully results.
Yeah, 100%. It really does most of the time, hopefully.
Okay, thank you so much for talking about this implications of recent political reforms on education for higher education. Fully funding our educational system is probably one of the best decisions our government can make
Yes.
for supporting the children of our nation. So, continuing on with that and hopefully leading into a more hopeful view and things like that from discussing more of the challenges that education has been faced with currently, I want to ask a little bit about your opinion of future directions. So, considering future direction, if you were to propose a future plan of direction to address the governing of education, what would you do and propose? And what are possible solutions to the educational issues happening right now?
Yeah, well, part of that is passing the Secure Schools Reauthorization Act. Big fan of that bill. That really makes sure that we're funding 4,400 school districts across the nation, 10 million kids. It's impacting rural communities. That'll really help to make a difference in rural communities, making sure that students, no matter where you're from, no matter what community you live in, no matter your zip code or your background, that we are making sure that they have the funding that they need there to provide a quality education for our students. We're making sure that we're passing pro-education measures that are increasing our funding, not taking away funding. And so those are some of the issues that we're seeing currently, is that there are institutions that are taking their funding away, that the federal government has taken their funding away. And so for us, it's making sure that we're really trying to encourage lawmakers to continue to invest in our education, because it's not only investing in our education, it's investing in our future, because our students right now are those that are going to be the future leaders of tomorrow. And I like to use the phrase that a lot of decisions that are made today are going to impact you and I. A lot more is going to impact those that are actually making those decisions right now. And that part of that is through their youth voice. And so we are encouraging young people to get involved, to spread their voice, to make sure that they are heard, especially in the policy process, to making sure that they can make a difference for their communities and for communities across the nation, by using their voice to use this activism and use their perspective, to really making sure that we encourage lawmakers to fully fund and continue to invest in funding for education and not decrease funding across the board, which we've seen in the past.
That definitely is a great standing and definitely good plan of future direction. And continuing on with that kind of call to action, if you had the opportunity to be sitting in a room with all of the governmental officials who regulate education based policies and decision making, what message would you want to say to them?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough question right there. One point that I would emphasize is, coming from a rural community, coming from a community where we often hear our students who say that they don't feel heard, they don't feel seen, they don't feel like their voices really matter in the policy discussions. coming from a community where we have a high rate of people that are socioeconomic disadvantaged, a high rate of on the ACEs score, a high rate of poverty, a high rate of first gen students. We have the melting pot that we call the melting pot of America. We have that here in our community, and so for me, that really helps. When we talk about these different perspectives and these different communities, I've kind of seen firsthand how these cuts and these impacts on education are directly, having a result on our students. And so, what I would really emphasize to leaders in education, leaders in our government, what I have been emphasizing over the past few years is that, look, we need to make sure that we are investing in our education, investing in our future, because really part of that funding for education is investing in our future. It's investing in you and I, it's investing in every single student across the nation. And so, part of that is making sure that we're not, continuing to cut education where it really matters. It's not cutting programs to help students get into college. It's not cutting programs that are directly impacting services and resources to our students. And it's especially not limiting their opportunities to pursue future career success and academic success beyond just high school. So that's really what I would encourage to them and really encourage them to look at again.
Definitely. That's definitely a strong point, especially with everything that we talked about, how important
Yeah.
funding is. And also, kind of bouncing off of that question, if you could say anything to the president, what would you say?
Well, I was part of the USSYP program that I got the chance to meet a bunch of officials across the nation that were doing important work, especially a part of it was in education. And we really talked about the differing perspectives amongst people. And what I would emphasize to President Trump and what some of our national partners have emphasized to him is that we're talking about America's children. We're talking about everyday people that are really just trying to get by and make a difference in their communities, and that really I think is what's starting to get to him. We're not talking about Democrat, Republican. We're not talking about DEI. We're not talking about CRT. We're talking about students that are just trying to get by. That are trying to get a good education and trying to make a livable living afterwards. And so that's really what we're trying to emphasize to him, and what I would emphasize to him as well.
That definitely makes sense for sure. And lastly, as the theme of messages is going, what message would you like to tell the students of the future and your fellow educators?
Yeah, the main thing is to get involved, to use your voice. I think it was Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. I believe this is a quote that I'm trying to off the top of my head right now. But she said that if you're at a table and you don't see a table, to bring up a folding chair. And I think that quote is super important because that there are times, and I've seen this in my policy work that I've done, is that you don't. There's not always people in that room that are going to make sure that you get a voice at the table. So it's important to you that that you stand up, and that you make sure that you have a voice at that table. Um, I think there was a congressman that told me that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that quote has been restated and resaid quite a few times. But really, the point behind that is ensuring and emphasizing that, hey, you really need to make sure that your voice gets involved in the policy process, because every single thing, all these decisions that are made today are going to impact, you and I, the young people, a lot more. That's going to impact those who are actually making these decisions. And so it's important that we get our voices involved, that we get involved in the policy process, and that's really what I would emphasize to students and to educators.
Absolutely, that's such a strong message. And thank you so much for all of the great insight that you've given us today. It's been such a pleasure being able to talk to you.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, thank you so much.